John Weltman is going to take us first into talking about the surrogacy process through an agency. So John, take it away.
Great, thanks Terry. My name is John Weltman. I'm a dad through surrogacy. I have 2 boys. They're now 14 and 15. And my husband and I have been together for 27 years, married 3 times to each other. I'm the founder and president of Circle Surrogacy, but I'm here not to talk about Circle per se, but just in general, what does an agency do? Basically, the first thing you need to understand that there are 2 types of surrogacy. One is the traditional surrogacy, which has been around for almost 30 years, and that's where a woman is inseminated and carries her own child to term. And the other is gestational surrogacy, or what for gay men we call egg donor surrogacy, where a woman is provided an embryo that's already developed from either your sperm or your and your partner's sperm, with the eggs being split into 2 petri dishes that are then implanted into that woman, and she carries it to term as a gestational carrier for you. And Melissa will talk a great deal about the difference in the law between the 2 programs, but most of the agencies now either don't do traditional surrogacy or don't do a lot of traditional surrogacy because of that legal differentiation and because of other legal impediments that the FDA and other agencies have set up for traditional surrogacy. But it does still exist. It certainly can still be done independently. I did it and had a wonderful experience with it. You will hear from others who also have done it and had good experiences with it. So it's certainly not something you can't do. There is a big difference between the 2. Traditional surrogacy only involves inseminations, so the entire cost of IVF and an egg donor goes away, so it can be a lot less expensive. Gestational surrogacy has a lot of protections for you. First of all, there's the wonderful choice of choosing a donor that fits right for you, which may be a very different kind of woman in her 20s, maybe college educated, very attractive, as opposed to a woman who's carried 3 children before and is in her late 20s or early 30s and would be a good host for carrying. It also allows a much higher level of success in terms of quickness of return. And is much better protected by the law. The first thing that I've been asked to talk to you about is how agencies go ahead and match carriers and donors. And I think in order to understand that, you have to understand a little bit about first how we screen carriers and donors. We are finding maybe 1 in 30 women who will pass our screening for a carrier, and maybe 1 in 10 women who will pass our screenings for a donor. They're very, very different kinds of screenings. One is much more genetically related, and the other one is much more obstetrically related. So you care much more with the carrier about what her obstetrical history is. You don't care about that with the donor, but you care a great deal about what her genetic history is. You don't care about it with the carrier. I'll let Kim talk in much greater detail with you about how that's done, but once it's done, and it needs to be looked at from a medical standpoint to make sure that they pass all medical screenings. It needs to be looked at from a legal standpoint to make sure that the law of the state they come from is good for you, and it ultimately can let you return to your home state of New York or wherever you live with a baby to make sure you're going to be dads forever on that birth certificate for that child. And also it has to be looked at psychologically. So if you have a psychologist or a social worker, really carefully screening that process to make sure that the women know what they're getting into, that they have a support system in their husbands, that these are the right people for this process, and that their motivations are right. Once we find those women, those extraordinary women, the key is matching them. And we work, and I know many of these other agencies up here too, work not just domestically, but also internationally. And also in New York in particular, we'll have many couples who are living in New York, but from other places. And so being able to obtain UK citizenship, or French citizenship, or Israeli citizenship, or whatever for a child is very important. So knowing from the first, what do you need to accomplish that is a really important part of that discovery process so that you can match the right person with the right surrogate. The same thing applies with donors, except that tends to be there are much fewer states where there are problems with donors, but there are much more differences between people in terms of what they're looking for. And so really getting a full sense of what is important to you is a really important part of doing that match. One of the biggest things in our program, and it's happening more and more in other programs, is the idea of whether you want an anonymous donor or a known donor. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but I think that what we found, and I think a lot of the psychologists have been saying over and over, is that there's an enormous emotional benefit to children later in life to be able to know where they came from. So we think there are lots of reasons to think about that, but that's something that some people don't feel comfortable with, and that's fine. You can say, I want an anonymous donor, I don't feel comfortable knowing who that person is, I don't want to meet her. And that's something which we need to know at the outset so we can find the right person for you. In terms of the typical gestational carrier track, I think it's fairly true between the three of us that most people would say if you wanted one number, 18 months would be the number that would come out of everybody's head. It takes some time to match you with a donor. Some people are very picky, and some people are not picky at all, and you're entitled to be as picky as you want to be. But that will slow down the process. So too with carriers, getting the right person for you and what you ultimately want is very important. So there'll be single dads, there'll be couples, there'll be people who want to put 2 embryos in, one of each at the same time. There'll be HIV positive men, or one who's HIV positive and one who isn't. Finding the right person for you is critical, and so the time frame of matching differs. But generally speaking, you can expect about 12 months and could be easily 18 months based on the number of tries you have to have. The costs for this process vary. There are lots of different kinds of programs out there, but I would say if someone is telling you that this is going to be under $100,000, be careful. It can be. I certainly think it'd be free for people. You know, find a friend who does a surrogacy, and we help support people through that kind of process too, and that can be very inexpensive, especially if it's a traditional surrogacy. It's something no one can give you $1 today because of things you don't know, like how quick are you going to get pregnant, and what's the IVF going to cost me. It's actually one of the reasons that a number of IVF clinics now will do risk-sharing programs where you can pay them a little extra and get 3 cycles or a portion or all even of your money back. And it's something to look into because you may think, oh, well, I've never had any fertility problems if you're a gay man, but you probably also haven't slept with that many women to try. So don't assume. So it's just something you need to be prepared for, and that's where the costs can change. Probably one of the biggest challenges of today is insurance. Surrogates with insurance have gone down dramatically over the years, and that we're down now to 20–25% of surrogates maybe who have an insurance policy that doesn't have an exclusion for surrogacy, and even if it doesn't, boy, can I tell you how ingenious those insurance companies can be in terms of finding a way around it. So you have to always think about the possibility of buying something like a backup policy, which is sold through Lloyd's of London, as an option that will cover you even if your surrogate has insurance. We can refer you to places that do this sort of thing, and I think it's something you should always talk about as part of the process. I would always say to you, bottom line, and this will be true for everybody here, work with an agency that has a lawyer and a social worker on staff. It is the two. I don't care if you've also got a surrogate on staff. I don't care if you've also got a parent on staff. But unless they're both of those, don't work with them. I feel very strongly about that because I think this is an incredibly emotional and legal process. I had a gay couple call me in tears because they were 13 weeks pregnant with twins, everything in their dream, and they just realized that their Ohio surrogate they couldn't get a second parent adoption with, and because they were from Florida, they couldn't get a second parent adoption there either. They couldn't get a pre-birth order anywhere, and they were screwed. They were never going to have both their names in the birth certificate. By the way, in Massachusetts and California, you can still do that. So if anybody gets you in that situation, give us a call. I happen to be admitted in both states, but other than that, it would have been a disaster for them. So that kind of matching needs a lawyer to direct it from the outset. And in terms of this process, the full service support of social workers or psychologists through this process to support you and the surrogate, this is the most intimate thing that any two people can do together, and you're doing it with a total stranger. You've got to have support through that process, and so does she.